The gun was already pressed against Levi Bailey's temple when Birdie Leland walked through the jailhouse door carrying a tin cup of coffee. She did not scream. She did not drop the cup. She stood in the doorway of the Caldwell County Jail on a Tuesday morning in October of 1882, her boots dusty from the walk across Main Street, her dark hair pinned back beneath a faded calico bonnet, and she looked at Sheriff Harlan Price with eyes that did not flinch even as the cold barrel gleamed in the early light. "Step back, Miss Leland," Price said through his teeth. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me plenty," she said, and she kept walking. The man in the chair, wrists bound behind him with rope, cheeks split and swollen from what looked like more than one fist, looked up at her with the most startling eyes she had ever seen. Gray-green like river water over stone. Even bruised, even bleeding from a cut above his brow, Levi Bailey looked at her like she was the most confusing thing he had ever encountered in all his 27 years of hard living. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you should leave." "You should drink your coffee," she said, and she set the tin cup on the table beside him with the precision of a woman who had made up her mind long before she walked through the door. Price took a step toward her. He was a thick man, red-faced, with a silver star that had been purchased more than earned. "I said step back. And I said it concerns me," Birdie replied, turning to face him with the full weight of her calm, which was the most dangerous thing in that room. "You don't have a warrant, Harlan. You don't have a judge's signature. You don't have a single piece of paper that says you can hold this man, let alone put a gun to his head, and every soul on this street knows it." The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled to breaking. Outside, a horse shifted in its traces. The wind moved through the gap under the door. Price lowered the gun, not out of conscience, out of calculation. And that calculation told him that Birdie Leland's father owned the only newspaper in Caldwell County, and that her testimony carried weight in a town that was already uneasy with the way Harlan Price ran things. He stepped back. He jerked his chin at the door. "Get him out of here. But he better be gone from this county by sundown, or the next time there won't be a cup of coffee to save him." She untied the ropes herself. Levi Bailey said nothing while she worked the knots. He watched her hands, quick and steady, and when the rope fell away and he flexed his wrists against the rawness, he picked up the coffee cup and drank from it, and the look on his face was not gratitude exactly. It was something older and quieter than gratitude. It was recognition. He would spend the rest of his life trying to understand why a woman who had never met him would walk into a room with a loaded gun and set a cup of coffee on the table like a declaration of war. She would spend the rest of her life being quietly glad she did. But none of that was visible yet. The story had to start where all the real stories start, which was not in the moment of crisis, but in the long, quiet accumulation of circumstances that made the crisis inevitable. And so you have to go back 6 weeks, to the morning Levi Bailey first rode into Dry Fork, which was the township that sat at the eastern edge of Caldwell County in the Kansas Territory in the autumn of 1882. The town was the kind of place that looked modest from a distance and revealed its tensions up close. The main street was wide and unpaved, rutted by wagon wheels and rain, lined with a general store, a feed merchant, a church that doubled as a schoolroom, a saloon called the Silver Spur, and a small newspaper office with a hand-painted sign that read Leland Courier above the door. Birdie Leland was 23 years old. She had been born in Dry Fork, grown up in the back of that newspaper office amid the smell of ink and paper and the clattering percussion of the hand press, and she had been setting type since she was old enough to reach the compositor's tray. Her father, Gerald Leland, was a good man who had aged faster than his years, and the paper had increasingly become hers in all but name. She wrote most of it. She set most of it. She delivered it on foot on Friday mornings, tucking folded copies beneath doors and into mailboxes, and leaving a stack at the general store counter. She was not a woman who was unaware of her situation. She had been proposed to twice, once by a cattle broker from Wichita who smelled of whiskey and ambition, and once by a gentle, dim farmer named Roscoe who would have been kind to her for the rest of her life and bored her completely. She had declined both with the same direct, unapologetic calm that she applied to everything. The women in town found her intimidating. The men found her confusing. Her father found her indispensable. And Birdie Leland found the whole arrangement mostly acceptable, because she had her work and her father and her small house, and a cat named Clarence, and she had never yet met a man who made her want anything that she didn't already have. Until the morning she went to the Silver Spur to follow up on a story about a card game dispute that had ended in a broken nose and 2 missing teeth. She did not go inside. Respectable women did not go inside the Silver Spur. She stood at the side door that led to the back hallway where Pete Holloway, the barman, sometimes agreed to speak with her through a half-open door, which he did, and she was scribbling in her notebook when she heard the voices from inside rise sharply, and then go quiet in that particular way that meant either someone had drawn a weapon or someone had said something so accurate and cutting that the room needed a moment to absorb it. She heard the second voice clearly because it was low and precise and entirely without the performance that most men put into their confrontations. "I'll pay what I owe," the voice said. "I always do, but I won't be threatened in addition." Pete Holloway's eyebrows went up. He closed the door. Birdie folded her notebook and went home and told herself she had imagined the quality of that voice. She had not imagined it. Levi Bailey had come to Dry Fork following work. That was the honest answer and also an incomplete one, because Levi had been following work for the better part of 7 years, across territories and counties and state lines, and the work had a way of being not quite what it appeared when you arrived. He had been a cattle drover, a fence mender, a horse breaker, a freight hauler, and for 8 months in Colorado he had been a deputy for a sheriff who turned out to be running a protection scheme on the ranchers he was supposed to be serving. That was the incident that had started the trouble. Levi had walked away from it, which was the right thing to do, but walking away from it had put him in the path of the sheriff's brother, who had connections, and the connections had connections, and somewhere along the line a version of events had been recorded in which Levi Bailey was not the man who walked away from corruption, but the man who had participated in it. The warrant had been issued in Dodge City. It described him as a known criminal associate of one Marcus Price, which was how he came to arrive in Dry Fork, not knowing that Marcus Price's brother Harlan was the sheriff of Caldwell County. He had taken work at the Dobson Ranch, 6 miles east of town. Old man Dobson was in his 60s and running the place with 2 hands who were barely managing and needed a third. He paid fairly and asked few questions. And Levi was good with horses and good with fences, and good with the kind of sustained, back-breaking labor that small cattle operations required. For the first 3 weeks, Dry Fork was simply the town he rode into on Saturday afternoons to collect supplies and drink 1 beer in relative peace. He noticed the newspaper office the 3rd time he passed it, because the window had been left open and he could hear the press running, and the rhythm of it was unexpectedly pleasant. He noticed Birdie Leland the 4th time he passed it, because she came out of the door at exactly the moment he was tying his horse to the post outside the general store, and she walked with the kind of purposeful stride that made you automatically step out of her way even if she hadn't asked you to. She did not notice him, or if she did, it did not register visibly. He bought his supplies, drank his beer, and rode back to the Dobson Ranch. He told himself there was nothing particular about the woman with the ink-stained fingers and the calico bonnet. He thought about her for 4 days straight. The 5th Saturday, he found an excuse to stop in front of the newspaper office. The excuse was that he needed to read the notices board that was nailed to the exterior wall, which contained information about livestock sales and community meetings, and he needed to read it very slowly and very thoroughly apparently, because he was still standing there when the door opened and Birdie Leland came out with a stack of papers under her arm and nearly walked into him. She stopped. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Just reading," he said. "The notice is board," she said, glancing at it. "There's a town meeting Thursday about the water rights, and Hendricks is selling his bay mare." "I saw that," he said. "The mare. Are you looking for a horse?" "I have a horse." She looked at the horse tied to the post. It was a good animal, a dark roan, well cared for. She nodded as though this confirmed something she had suspected. "Are you working for someone in the county?" "Dobson Ranch," he said. She wrote something in the small notebook she apparently carried everywhere. He watched her do it and felt the absurd and irrational desire to know what she had written. "What was that?" he asked. She looked up. What you wrote." She studied him for a moment. Most people did not ask her that. "New hand at Dobson's," she said. "I keep notes, it's a habit." "What newspaper do you have me going into?" he asked. "None," she said. "I don't print things about individual ranch hands arriving in the county." "Good," he said. And then, because he was not accustomed to conversation feeling like this, like being pulled forward against your better judgment, he said, "Levi Bailey." She looked at him again with those direct, dark eyes that seemed to be conducting a private audit. "Birdie Leland." "Leland," he said, "as in the paper." "My father's," she said. "And mine increasingly." He nodded. He untied his horse. He rode back to the Dobson ranch and arrived late enough that old man Dobson gave him a look, and Levi said nothing and went to rub down the roan. The third Saturday after that, he walked into the Leland Courier. She was at the compositor's tray, setting type with the focused attention of someone performing surgery. She looked up when the bell above the door rang and then looked back at her work when she saw who it was, which was either dismissal or concentration, and he couldn't tell which. "Mr. Bailey," she said. "I wanted to place a notice," he said, "about the Dobson mare. The old man decided to sell after all." She set down her composing stick and went to the counter and found her ledger. Description. He gave her the information. She wrote it down. He watched her write and tried not to make it obvious that he was watching her. "That'll be 10 cents for the week," she said, which was the standard rate for a livestock notice. He paid it. He did not immediately leave. She returned to the compositor's tray. "What are you working on?" he asked. She glanced at him over her shoulder. "The water rights dispute. 2 of the ranchers in the south part of the county are diverting upstream, and it's affecting the smaller farmers. I'm trying to make sure the story is accurate before I print it." "Which ranchers?" She hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "The Carver operation and the Stillwell brothers." Levi was quiet for a moment. "Carver has connections to the county sheriff," he said. She turned around fully. "How do you know that?" "Because I listened," he said. "At the Silver Spur, men talk when they think no one's paying attention." She studied him with new interest. "What else did you hear?" "Enough to know your water rights story might get complicated," he said. "You should be careful." The concern in his voice was genuine, and she recognized that. She also recognized that genuine concern from a man she barely knew, delivered without condescension, or the particular kind of false protectiveness that men often deployed toward women doing things men thought women shouldn't do, was an unusual thing. "Thank you for the warning," she said carefully. He nodded. He picked up his hat from the counter. He went to the door and then stopped. "Could I read it?" he said. "When you print it, the story," she blinked. "Everyone in town will have access to it." "I meant before," he said, and then seemed to recognize how that sounded and adjusted his ground. "If it's useful to have another set of eyes, someone who's heard things. I'm not offering to tell you what to write." She was quiet for a long moment. The press sat in the back corner of the room, silent and patient, the smell of the ink a constant low note beneath everything. "Come back Thursday," she said. "I'll have a draft." He came back Thursday. He read the draft carefully and said very little, and what he said was measured and specific, and did not attempt to minimize the story, but to make it more accurate and more defensible. He told her that Carver had not merely diverted water but had physically removed a portion of the shared creek bed wall that dated back to the original territorial survey, which was a legal distinction that mattered, and he told her he had seen it himself while repairing fence line for Dobson along the county boundary. She asked him to show her on a map. He did. She drew the location in her notebook. "Will you testify to this?" she asked. "If it comes to that." "I'll do what's right," he said, which was not quite a yes and not quite a no, and she accepted it because something in his manner told her that he had reasons for being careful about his visibility in the county, and she had not yet asked him about those reasons. She printed the story. It ran in the Friday edition. By Saturday afternoon, the county was talking about it. By Monday morning, Sheriff Harlan Price had appeared at her door. She faced him across the counter of the courier office with her father sitting in the back, pretending to organize paper stock. Price was not overtly threatening. He was the kind of man who threatened obliquely, through implication and proximity and the weight of the badge on his chest. "That story about Carver's operation is full of inaccuracies," he said pleasantly. "Name one," she said. He could not name one. He smiled instead. "You might want to be careful about your sources, Miss Leland. Someone's been filling your head with information that doesn't serve the county's interests." "The county's interests," she said. "Or yours?" The smile stayed on his face but went out of his eyes. "We're all friends here," he said. "Let's try to keep it that way." After he left, her father came out from the back. Gerald Leland was a slight man with white hair and a newspaper man's permanent squint. He looked at his daughter with love and worry in equal measure. "He's going to find out who gave you the survey information," Gerald said. "I know," said Birdie. "You need to warn whoever it was." She was already reaching for her bonnet. She rode out to the Dobson Ranch for the first time in her life on that Monday afternoon. It was a longer ride than she'd expected, the road winding through flat grassland broken by the occasional cottonwood, the sky enormous and faintly threatening with cloud. She found Levi at the fence line, which seemed to be where he spent much of his time, mending wire with the focused competence of someone who has been taught that there is dignity in any honest work. He saw her coming and set down his tools and waited. She dismounted without fanfare and told him what Price had said. He listened without expression, which she was beginning to understand was not coldness but caution, the trained stillness of a man who had learned that reacting too quickly cost you. "He'll find out it was me eventually," Levi said when she finished. "I won't tell him," she said immediately. "I know you won't," he said, and the certainty in his voice surprised both of them. "But this is a small county. He has people everywhere." He looked out across the fence line for a moment, and she saw something pass through his expression that she could not yet name. It was not fear. It was more like the weary recognition of a man who has been here before. "There's something you're not telling me," she said. He looked at her. The October light was making the grassland gold around them, and a hawk was turning slow circles against the sky, and Levi Bailey made a decision that he could feel was important even though he couldn't entirely articulate why. "Come sit down," he said. "This will take a few minutes." They sat on the fence rail and he told her. He told her about the Dodge City deputy position and the protection scheme and Marcus Price and the warrant. He told her plainly, without self-pity or embellishment, because she was the kind of woman who would see through both and he respected her too much to try either. He told her he was not the man described in the warrant. He told her he understood if she didn't believe him. She was quiet for a long moment after he finished. A meadowlark called somewhere to the south. "Why did you tell me?" she asked. "Because you're about to be used as a pressure point against me," he said. "And I thought you deserved to know why." She absorbed this. "So this water rights story put you directly in Price's line of sight." "It was going to happen regardless," he said. "As soon as someone in town mentioned to him that there was a new hand at Dobson's from Dodge City, he would have made the connection." "Has anyone mentioned it yet?" "I don't know." She looked at him for a long moment. He had dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days and hands that were scarred in the particular way of men, who worked outdoors with wire and leather. And he looked back at her with those gray-green eyes that seemed to be waiting patiently for her to reach whatever conclusion she was going to reach. "I believe you," she said. Something shifted in his face, not relief exactly, something more complicated than relief. "You shouldn't take my word for it," he said. "I'm not taking your word for it," she said. "I'm taking the whole of it. I'm a journalist. I look at the sum of things." She stood up from the fence rail and brushed dust from her skirt. I'm going to write to the Dodge City Register. They covered criminal proceedings there. If there's a record of this warrant, there'll be a record of the circumstances. Birdie, he said, and it was the first time he had used her name, and it landed between them with a weight that neither of them commented on. That could take weeks. And if Price identifies me before then we'll deal with it, she said. And in the meantime, you should know that the only diner in town is run by a woman named Mabel Crow, who has been quietly fighting Price's influence on the town council for 2 years, and she knows every person who comes and goes through this county. If you need information, she's the one to ask. He looked at her with an expression she would think about many times in the weeks to come. It was the expression of a man who had been operating alone for so long that the simple act of someone standing beside him was almost more disorienting than the danger itself. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just be careful." She rode back to town. She sat down at the writing table in the courier office and wrote a letter to the Dodge City Register. She wrote a second letter to the county court clerk in Ford County, Kansas, requesting any available documentation regarding a warrant issued in the name of Levi Bailey. She sealed them and mailed them that evening and told herself that this was journalism. This was what she did. It had nothing to do with the way his voice had sounded when he said her name. Clarence the cat sat on the corner of her writing table and watched her not believe herself with the serene disinterest of a creature who has seen everything. 2 weeks passed. They were not uneventful weeks. The water rights story gained traction. 2 of the smaller farmers from the south part of the county came to the courier office to add their accounts to the public record, which Birdie printed carefully and factually. The Carver operation responded by sending a lawyer's letter, which she also printed, with her own annotations about its legal inaccuracies. The town began to choose sides in the slow, inescapable way that small towns do, which is to say that most people chose the side of whoever they had dinner with. Levi continued to work at the Dobson Ranch and continued to come into town on Saturdays. He began, without any explicit arrangement, to stop at the courier office on his way in and again on his way out. The first visit was ostensibly to check for any responses to the notices board. The second visit became, gradually and without anyone deciding it, the visit where he drank a cup of coffee and told her what he'd heard, and she told him what she'd learned, and they sat across the table from each other in the late afternoon light while Gerald Leland made himself busy in the back and pretended not to listen. The coffee was a specific thing. Birdie ground her own beans, bought from the general store, and kept a small stove in the back corner of the courier office for the purpose of printing marathon sessions that required sustained warmth and alertness. The coffee she made was strong and slightly bitter, and she drank it black. When Levi first accepted a cup from her, he drank it the same way without being asked, which she noted. "Most men take sugar," she said. "Most men don't know what coffee tastes like," he replied. She smiled. It was a brief smile, controlled, the smile of a woman who has been managing her own expressions for a long time. But he saw it. He catalogued it with the same careful attention he applied to everything, because he was beginning to understand that Birdie Leland's smiles were not common currency, and therefore worth considerably more than the ordinary kind. They talked about many things during those October afternoons. About the water rights case, which had now attracted the attention of a state land surveyor from Topeka. About the town council, where 3 of the 5 members had financial ties to either Carver or to Price's family. About the newspaper, which was struggling financially the way most small papers did, dependent on advertising from the same merchants who were also dependent on the goodwill of the sheriff. About her father's health, which she mentioned once and then did not mention again, but which Levi filed away because the brevity with which she mentioned it told him more than elaboration would have. He told her about his 7 years of moving. He was more guarded about this, not from dishonesty but from habit, but she had a way of asking questions that were so precise and so genuinely curious that you found yourself answering before you decided to. He told her about the horse breaking in Wyoming, which he had loved. He told her about the deputy position in Colorado, which he had believed in until he understood what he had actually been hired into. He told her that he had a brother in Missouri he had not seen in 4 years, not because of any falling out but because the distance between places and the difficulty of correspondence had allowed time to accumulate without him noticing until it was too large to easily cross. "You should write to him," she said. "I should do many things," he said. She looked at him with those direct eyes. "Does he know where you are?" "No," he said. "Write to him," she said again. "I'll post the letter myself." He looked at her for a moment. "You're very direct." "I'm a journalist," she said. "Indirectness is a professional liability." "Is that the only reason?" he asked. The question was quiet and personal and slightly more than professional, and they both knew it. She held his gaze for a beat longer than was strictly necessary before she picked up her composing stick. "Write the letter," she said. He wrote the letter that night. He posted it through the courier office on Monday. He told himself he had done it because she was right that his brother deserved to know where he was. He suspected he had also done it because the prospect of Birdie Leland posting a letter on his behalf made him feel less entirely alone in Caldwell County than he had been before. The response from the Dodge City Register arrived on the 14th of October. Birdie opened it at the compositing table on a Thursday morning and read it twice before she allowed herself to react. Then she put on her bonnet and rode out to the Dobson Ranch. Levi was in the barn when she arrived, working with a young horse that was still learning to accept a saddle. He saw her face as she dismounted and his hands went still on the horse's neck. "What did it say?" he asked. She handed him the letter. He read it standing in the barn doorway with the morning light behind him, and she watched his face as he read, and what she saw there was not surprise. It was the particular anguish of a man seeing his worst fear confirmed, and his fundamental innocence vindicated at the same time, which are two different kinds of grief with nothing comfortable between them. The Register's archives editor had confirmed. A warrant had been issued in Dodge City against Levi Bailey in March of 1881. The warrant had subsequently been disputed by the district judge in Ford County after review of the actual testimony, which showed that Bailey had reported the protection scheme to the circuit court rather than participating in it. The warrant had been annotated as contested but had never been formally withdrawn because the Price family's connections in Dodge City included 2 men who sat on the county commission. The legal status of the warrant was therefore actively ambiguous, which was the kind of ambiguity that Marcus Price and his brother Harlan could exploit indefinitely. "It's not enough," Levi said, setting the letter down on a fence post with careful precision, as if he were afraid of what his hands might do otherwise. "The contest is noted, but the warrant stands. Harlan Price can take this letter and use it to argue that the warrant is still valid and the challenge was politically motivated." "I know," Birdie said, "but I also wrote to the Ford County clerk. If the judge's notes are in the court record, that's a different kind of document, that's formal." He looked at her. "You wrote to the court clerk?" 2 weeks ago," she said. "The same day I wrote to the Register." He was quiet for a moment. A question moved across his face and then settled into something else, something warmer and more uncertain. "Birdie," he said. "Don't," she said, because she could see what was forming behind his eyes and she wasn't ready for it, and she had a very strong instinct that if either of them named it too directly too soon, something fragile and important would break. He nodded. He picked the letter back up. "How long for the clerk's response?" "Another week," she said. "Maybe 2. Price is already looking," he said. 3 days ago, one of the Dobson hands mentioned that someone had been asking around about me at the Silver Spur, asking where I was from and how long I'd been in the county." She felt the cold edge of this. "You need to be careful." "I've been careful my whole life," he said, and there was a bitterness in it that was brief and real and then gone, tucked back behind the composure. "I'm tired of being careful." She understood that. She understood it more than she was prepared to say. She thought of her own version of careful, the way she weighed every word she printed, the way she walked the line between truth and the legal and social consequences of truth in a county where the law was corrupt, and the merchants were afraid, and the only protection she had was the civic importance of the press and the goodwill of the people who still believed in it. "One more week," she said. "Try to stay out of town." He agreed. He did not come in the following Saturday. The week stretched long and taut, and she threw herself into the water rights story and the town council coverage and the quiet correspondence with the land surveyor from Topeka, and she told herself she was not watching the road from the east every afternoon, and the road did not believe her. On the Thursday of that second week, the letter from the Ford County clerk arrived. It was detailed. It was official. It contained a signed statement from Judge Bernard Hatch of the Ford County District Court, confirming that the Bailey warrant had been reviewed and found to be procedurally suspect, that the original complainant, Marcus Price, had given testimony that was later contradicted by 3 independent witnesses, and that the judge had formally recommended withdrawal of the warrant, which recommendation had been refused on political grounds. The clerk had attached a copy of the judge's recommendation as a matter of public record. It was exactly what they needed. Birdie was reading it when the office door opened and Harlan Price walked in. She folded the letter. She did it calmly and deliberately, the way you move when you know that the wrong movement will cost you. Price had 2 men with him, not deputies exactly, more like the kind of men who are employed for their willingness to stand somewhere and look large. "Miss Leland," Price said pleasantly, "I've come on official business. There's a wanted man operating in this county, and I have reason to believe you've been in contact with him." "A lot of people are in contact with a lot of people in this county," she said. "It's a small county. Levi Bailey," he said, "you know where he is." "I know he works at the Dobson Ranch," she said. "Which is a matter of public knowledge since his employer is a subscriber to this paper and mentions him in casual conversation." Price smiled. "I'm going to need you to come with me, Miss Leland, for your own safety." "I'm in my own office," she said. "I'm perfectly safe." The 2 large men moved slightly. It was not overt. It was the kind of movement that is intended to recalibrate your sense of where the exits are. Gerald Leland came out of the back room. He was a slight man and he was carrying nothing, and the expression on his face was the expression of a father who has just understood that his daughter is in actual danger and has decided that his own physical safety is less important than making that visible. "You are in a newspaper office, Harlan," Gerald said in his quiet voice. "Whatever happens here will be printed. And the Topeka Register has been in correspondence with my daughter about the water rights case, which means we have relationships with editors who print things to a considerably wider audience than the Caldwell County Courier." Price looked at Gerald for a long moment. Then he looked at Birdie. Then he looked at the folded letter in her hands. "What's that?" he said. "My correspondence," she said, "which you have no legal authority to demand." He left. This time the calculation did not include her as a lever he could use. It recalibrated as a different threat, as the very real possibility that the story she was building had outgrown his ability to suppress it by local means alone. He needed to move faster. He needed to eliminate the corroborating source, which was Levi Bailey, before the documentation became publicly distributed enough to matter. She sent a boy from the print shop, a 15-year-old named Tommy Graves who was reliable and quick, out to the Dobson Ranch that afternoon with a note. The note said, "He knows. Come in tonight. Bring whatever you have." Levi arrived at the Courier office at 8 that evening. Her father was there. The lamp was lit. She had the Ford County letter laid out on the table alongside the Register letter, alongside a draft of the article she had been preparing, which named Price directly and cited the court record. He read everything. He sat across from her at the printing table and read everything carefully, and then he sat back and looked at the lamp flame for a moment. "If you print this," he said. "When I print this," she corrected. "When you print this," he agreed, "Price will come after both of us." "He'll come after you regardless," she said, At least this way there's a record. The Topeka Register gets a copy, the State Land Office gets a copy, and I'll send one to the circuit court." "You've already planned all of it," he said. "I've been planning it for a week," she said. "I was waiting for the clerk's letter." He looked at her across the table, and the lamp light was the warm, close light of a room where something significant has been decided, and Gerald Leland had tactfully gone to make coffee in the back. "Birdie," Levi said. "I know," she said. "I want to say something," he said. "All right," she said. "I've been moving from place to place for 7 years," he said, "and in 7 years I have not once wanted to stay anywhere, and I want you to know that that has changed." He said it plainly, without decoration, the way he did everything, and the plainness of it made it more powerful than any elaborate declaration would have been. It changed about 3 weeks ago on a Saturday afternoon in a newspaper office that smelled like ink. She was quiet. He watched her and let the quiet be. "We have to print the story first," she said finally. "I know," he said, "and deal with price." "Yes, and get you legally clear." "Also yes." "And then," she said, and she said it carefully, like setting down a very fragile piece of type, "we can talk about what changes." Her father came back with the coffee. He set 3 cups on the table with perfect timing and the expression of a man who has heard nothing at all. They worked until midnight, finalizing the article, preparing the copies for distribution, drafting the letters to the Topeka Register and the State Land Office and the Circuit Court. Gerald ran the press while Birdie proofread and Levi helped fold and sort, which was not a skill anyone would have predicted he had, but which he performed with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. At midnight, when the papers were ready and the ink was drying and the 3 copies for out-of-county distribution were sealed and addressed and ready for the morning mail, Gerald went home to bed. Birdie walked Levi to the door of the office. The street was quiet and dark, the stars enormous above the flat Kansas horizon. "Stay at the Dobson Ranch tonight," she said. "Don't go to the Silver Spur and don't go anywhere that Price's men frequent." "I know," he said. He had his hat in his hands, and he was looking at her with that particular focused quality that she was beginning to understand meant he was deciding something. He made the decision. He put one hand very briefly against her face, his thumb along her jaw, and it was a gesture of such deliberate and contained tenderness that she stood very still under it as if moving would break the moment. "Good night, Birdie," he said. "Good night, Levi," she said. He rode back to the Dobson Ranch under the enormous sky. She stood in the doorway of the Courier office for a long moment after the sound of his horse faded, her hand at her jaw where his hand had been. Then she went inside and checked the locks and blew out the lamp. The Friday edition of the Leland Courier was distributed on the following morning, and it contained an article on the front page, above the fold, with Birdie Leland's byline, that laid out the full account of the contested warrant against Levi Bailey, the Ford County judge's recommendation, the political suppression of that recommendation, and the documented connection between Marcus Price, Harlan Price, and the Carver water diversion scheme that had been Levi's initial corroborating testimony. It was careful journalism. Every claim was sourced. Every document was cited. The language was measured and factual and entirely devastating. By noon, Price had read it. By 3 in the afternoon, he had ridden to the Dobson Ranch with 2 men and found Levi gone, because Tommy Graves had ridden out early that morning with another note from Birdie saying that the paper was going out and to make himself absent for the day, and Levi had gone south along the county line to do fence work well away from the main road. By 5 in the afternoon, Price was at the Courier office. He did not bring a warrant this time, because the article had made warrants politically inconvenient. He came with his personal authority and his badge and the 2 large men, and he told Birdie that she had defamed a county official and that he intended to see her charged for it. She handed him a copy of the Ford County Court document. "Every claim I made is sourced," she said. "The law in Kansas regarding press freedom is clear, but more importantly, the circuit court judge in Wichita has already received a copy of this edition, as has the Topeka Register, and both have been informed that any interference with this office or its personnel by county law enforcement will be considered a matter of state concern. Price stood there. His jaw was tight. And furthermore, Gerald Leland said from the back of the office, where he had been standing, Birdie noticed, with his old Springfield rifle in his hands. Gerald had not carried the rifle in many years. It was a measure of how seriously he was taking the situation. Price looked at the rifle. He looked at Birdie. He looked at the stack of printed papers on the counter, knowing that hundreds of copies of this paper were already in the hands of the people of Caldwell County. He left, for the second time, but he did not go home. He went to the jail, and he waited. The problem was that Levi did not know to avoid the jail. He knew to stay off the main road and away from the Silver Spur and the main areas of town, but the jail was on a side street, and Levi, returning from the fence line in the early evening and stopping at the feed merchant's to pick up an order for Old Man Dobson, passed the side street at the wrong moment and found himself face to face with Price and his men before he had time to recalculate. They took him into the jail. It was not legally clean. It was not even the appearance of legal. It was a man with a badge and men who answered to him, and a door with a lock, which was the practical reality of what law enforcement meant in a county where corruption had been operating unchallenged for long enough to feel like weather. Price put the gun to his head. He was not going to shoot him. He was too politically damaged by now for that. But he wanted the information about what Birdie had, and who she had sent it to, and whether there was anything that could be intercepted or contradicted. He wanted Levi to be afraid enough to talk. Levi did not talk. He sat in the chair with his wrists bound and his cheek split and his eye beginning to swell, and he was afraid, because being afraid was the appropriate response to a gun against your temple. But he was also thinking, and what he was thinking was that Birdie had already sent the letters and already distributed the papers, and that there was nothing Price could learn from him that would reverse anything that had already been set in motion. So there was nothing to gain from talking and nothing to lose from silence. He had been sitting there for approximately 3 hours when he heard the bell above the jailhouse door ring, and he looked up, and Birdie Leland walked in with a tin cup of coffee. He watched her set the cup on the table with the steadiness of a woman who has made her decision and arrived at the other side of fear. He watched her face Price with that particular calm that he now understood was not the absence of emotion, but the decision to convert emotion into action rather than display. He watched Price lower the gun. And when she untied the ropes herself and he picked up the coffee cup and drank from it while his wrists ached, and his face was beginning to bruise in several places, what he felt was something that he did not have an adequate word for. It was something in the register of gratitude and wonder and the specific vertigo of a man who has been alone a long time and has just understood that he is not alone anymore. "We need to go," she said quietly. "Where?" he asked. "My father has a buckboard ready," she said. "We're going to Wichita. The circuit court judge wants a meeting." "Tonight," he said. "Tonight," she said. "Price won't move on us if we're on the road to a circuit court judge. He's damaged, but he's not stupid." Levi stood up. He was stiff from the rope and the sitting, and there were angles of his face that hurt more than others, but he was standing, and that was enough. He looked at Price, who was standing by the wall with the gun at his side and the expression of a man watching his options narrow to a single point. "You should resign," Levi said to him, not as a threat, as a practical observation. "Don't push it," Birdie said quietly, taking his arm. They went out into the night. Gerald had the buckboard waiting on the side street with 2 horses and a lantern, and he had also brought a coat for Levi and a loaf of bread and cheese wrapped in cloth, which was so quintessentially Gerald that Levi almost laughed. They drove through the night toward Wichita. Birdie sat between the 2 men on the buckboard seat, which was narrow, which meant that her shoulder was against Levi's arm for the entirety of the drive, and neither of them commented on this. Gerald held the reins and occasionally hummed something tuneless and kept his eyes on the road. Levi ate the bread and cheese because he had not eaten since morning. Birdie drank from a canteen. The stars were brilliant, and the grassland rolled away on either side in darkness, and the horses moved at a steady trot through the cold night air. At some point after midnight, Levi said quietly, "You walked into a room with a loaded gun and brought me coffee." "I knew he wasn't going to shoot you," she said. "Not in the current political climate. That's why you weren't afraid." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't say I wasn't afraid." He looked at the side of her face in the lantern light. "Birdie." She turned to look at him. They were very close on the narrow seat. "I meant what I said Thursday night," he said. "I know," she said. "I would like to say it more explicitly." Gerald continued to look at the road and continued to hum tunelessly. He was a man of considerable tact. "When we're through this," she said, which was not no. "When we're on the other side of it." He nodded. He put his hand over hers where it rested on the seat between them, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they rode the rest of the way to Wichita like that in the darkness. The meeting with Judge William Albright of the Wichita Circuit Court took place on Saturday morning. Albright was a spare, meticulous man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses, and the manner of someone who has seen every variety of legal corruption and developed a corresponding intolerance for it. He received the documents Birdie had compiled, including the Ford County Clerk's materials and the Register's archived coverage, and he read them with an attention that suggested he was not performing thoroughness, but actually experiencing it. He asked Levi to give a formal account of his time as deputy in Colorado and his report to the Ford County Court. Levi did so, clearly and in order, and Albright asked several specific questions that Levi answered with the same precision. At the end of the morning, Albright removed his glasses, polished them, replaced them, and said, "The warrant against Mr. Bailey was procedurally deficient from the moment of issuance. I am issuing a formal withdrawal. That withdrawal will be communicated to every law enforcement body in the state and to the neighboring territories by end of week." Birdie was writing in her notebook. She did not look up, but something in her shoulders released. "As for Sheriff Price," Albright continued, "the information Ms. Leland has provided, in conjunction with the State Land Office's correspondence regarding the water rights violations, gives this court grounds to open a formal inquiry. I'll be appointing a state marshal to Caldwell County pending the outcome." Levi was quiet on the way back to the buckboard. Gerald excused himself to find something to eat, which was again tactful. "It's done," Birdie said when they were standing beside the buckboard in the pale November-approaching sunlight. "It's done," he agreed. "The warrant is withdrawn." "Yes." She was looking at him, he was looking at her. The long, accumulated tension of the past weeks was somewhere behind them now, and what remained was this: the two of them standing in the Wichita courthouse yard on a cool Saturday morning with the story resolved and the future absolutely unconstrained by any of the things that had constrained it before. "I believe you were going to say something explicitly," she said. His mouth moved in what was almost a smile. "I was," he said. "Birdie, I love you. I have been, I think, loving you since the Thursday afternoon you showed me a draft article about water rights and corrected my map reading, which was not incorrect but which you improved, and I did not mind being improved by you, which is when I knew." She laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, startled out of her by the specificity of it, and it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. "I love you too," she said, which she said with the same directness she applied to everything. No hedge, no qualifier, just the plain fact of it laid down like type in the compositor's tray. "I knew when you read my draft and told me the legal distinction about the creek bed without telling me what to do with it. That's a very specific moment," he said. "I'm a specific person," she said. He crossed the 2 steps between them and kissed her there in the courthouse yard in the Wichita morning, and she kissed him back with exactly the same directness and honesty with which she did everything. And Gerald Leland, returning from across the street with a paper bag of biscuits, stopped on the corner and smiled so quietly and thoroughly that anyone watching would have thought he was looking at something entirely private. He was. They drove back to Dry Fork that afternoon, arriving by evening. The town was not unaware of what had happened. News in small counties has a way of moving faster than buckboards. Several people came out to the street as the Leland buckboard came down Main Street, and Mabel Crow appeared in the doorway of her diner and nodded once at Birdie with the expression of a woman who had been quietly betting on this outcome for some time. Sheriff Harlan Price was not in the jailhouse. He had, as Levi had suggested, resigned. Or more accurately, he had submitted a letter to the county commission that morning citing personal reasons, and had been seen loading a horse at the livery before noon. Whether he would face formal consequences at the state level was a matter for the inquiry, which was now a matter of record. The state marshal arrived the following week. The water rights case was resolved by December through the state land office's intervention, which ordered Carver and the Stillwell brothers to restore the creek bed wall under penalty of property forfeiture. The small farmers in the south part of the county held a meeting of gratitude that Birdie covered with the same dispassionate accuracy she brought to everything, though she did allow herself one editorial line at the end of the piece, which said, "The long record of this county demonstrates that transparency in local government is not a civic luxury. It is the mechanism by which ordinary people protect themselves from the abuse of power. We are glad to report it working as designed." Gerald framed that editorial line and hung it in the back of the office. Levi stayed. This was perhaps the detail that surprised him most, or not so much the staying as the ease of it. He had been moving for so long that he had forgotten the sensation of choosing a place because it contained something worth staying for. He went back to the Dobson Ranch through November, finishing the season's work, and in December, when old man Dobson went to stay with his daughter in Abilene for the winter, Levi began looking at what Dry Fork itself had to offer a man with his skills. What it had to offer was an opportunity. The livery stable on the north end of Main Street was owned by a man named Corbett, who was 65 and increasingly interested in retirement. The stable was sound, and the location was good, and Levi had enough saved from 7 years of work to make an offer that Corbett considered for 2 days and then accepted. By the time January arrived, Levi Bailey was a business owner in Dry Fork, Kansas, which was a fact that sat so differently on him than the life he had been living that he spent the first week in the stable simply standing in the morning light and feeling the solidity of it. He and Birdie did not rush. This was partly temperament and partly circumstance, and partly the specific way that two people who have each been managing alone for a long time negotiate the architecture of being together. They spent their evenings at the courier office or at Mabel Crow's diner or walking the perimeter of the town in the cold winter air, talking with the inexhaustible mutual interest of people who have found someone they cannot quite stop wanting to know. They were careful with each other in the way that matters, which is not the carefulness of distance but the carefulness of attention, the understanding that something valuable is present and deserves to be handled with intention. Gerald watched all of this with deep contentment. His health was not strong, which was the thing Birdie did not talk about but thought about constantly, the faint cough that had been following him since summer and the weight he had lost, and the way he sometimes stopped at the press with his hand flat against it, as if drawing something from the steadiness of the machine. He was not alarmed about it in the way she was, or if he was, he managed it in the particular way of a man who has decided that worry is less useful than presence. Levi noticed. He did not press Birdie about it, but he made small adjustments, coming to help with the heavier press work without being asked, picking up supplies that would otherwise require an extra trip, arriving at the office in the early mornings with coffee from the diner because Mabel Crow made it reliably, and he had learned that Birdie's worst mornings were better with reliable coffee, and the particular quality of attention he was able to offer. It was Gerald who finally said, on a Sunday evening in February, "Levi, I think you should marry my daughter before spring." They were sitting at the kitchen table in the Leland house, which Levi had been invited to for Sunday dinner with increasing regularity through the winter. Birdie looked at her father with a complicated expression, Levi looked at Gerald with the expression of a man who has been thinking the same thing and has been deciding on the timing. "That's a conversation for Birdie and me," Levi said. "She'll take forever," Gerald said affectionately. "She's very thorough." "Father," Birdie said. "He's right, by the way," Levi said to her. She looked at him, he looked at her. Gerald found his coffee cup very interesting. "Is this a proposal?" she asked. "If you want it to be," he said. "Or a declaration of intent, whichever format is most comfortable." "You're asking me," she said. "I am," he said. "Birdie, will you marry me?" She was quiet for a long moment. Gerald sat very still. Outside the kitchen window, a February wind moved through the bare cottonwood in the yard. "Yes," she said, "and then I want to keep writing for the paper." "Obviously," he said, "and the newspaper keeps the Leland name even after. I would expect nothing else. And you'll be content with a woman who has opinions and prints them publicly." He looked at her with steady gray-green eyes. "I'm in love with a woman who has opinions and prints them publicly. I'm not looking to change the thing I love." Gerald put his coffee cup down and said "good," with the relief and satisfaction of a man closing a chapter he has been very worried about. They married in March of 1883, in the Dry Fork Church on a clear, cold morning, with Mabel Crow standing as witness and old man Dobson, who had returned from Abilene, in the front pew. Tommy Graves sat in the second pew and had to be told twice to stop fidgeting. The minister was a mild man named Reverend Hollies, who managed the service with genuine warmth. Birdie wore a cream-colored dress that had been her mother's, let out and rehemmed by Mabel's steady hands, and she carried small wildflowers that Levi had ridden 10 miles to find at the earliest edge of spring, which was the kind of gesture that most people would not have expected from him, because it did not fit the practical exterior, and which was therefore exactly the kind of gesture Birdie loved most. He kissed her in the church with the same contained deliberateness with which he did everything, and she kissed him back with the directness that was all her own, and the small congregation of Dry Fork citizens who had watched this unlikely story unfold over the past several months sat in their pews with the satisfaction of people who have witnessed something they feel they were right to believe in. They walked out into the March morning together, into the dust and wind and sunlight of Main Street, past the courier office and the feed merchant and the silver spur and the livery stable that was his, through the town that was theirs. Gerald's health improved somewhat in the spring. Not dramatically, but enough that he was at the press 3 days a week and occasionally walked to Mabel's for breakfast, which had been beyond him in January. He and Levi had developed a friendship that was specific and warm in the manner of men who do not talk about their feelings directly, but demonstrate them through consistent and thoughtful action. They played chess on Sunday evenings. Gerald was the better player. Levi was improving, which Gerald considered adequate progress and occasionally complimented with the restrained generosity of a good teacher. The courier grew. Birdie's coverage of the water rights case had attracted attention from editors in Topeka and Wichita, and the paper began receiving occasional syndication requests for her pieces on county governance and press freedom. She handled these negotiations herself with the same composure she brought to everything, and the revenue helped stabilize the paper's finances through the spring and into summer. Levi built the livery business steadily. He had a good eye for horses and a reputation for honest dealing, which in a small town is a form of currency that compounds over time. By summer he had hired a hand, a young man of 20 named Curtis who was reliable and eager, and who reminded Levi, in certain angles of light, of the young man he had been before the Colorado business had made everything complicated. He was patient with Curtis in the way that someone who has been corrected unfairly is sometimes patient with people who are learning, having understood what correction feels like from the wrong side. In August, Birdie told him she was expecting. She told him in the way she did things, directly, at the kitchen table of what was now their shared house, on a Monday evening after supper. She said it, and then waited for his response with the straightforward courage of someone who already knows that the response will be good but who still feels the vulnerability of the moment. He set down his fork. He looked at her. The summer evening was coming in through the window, the last long light of August, and she was watching him with those direct dark eyes and the very slight set of someone bracing for something even when they expect warmth. He reached across the table and took her hand. He held it with both of his. He said, "Birdie," with all the things that her name contained for him now, and then he said, "I cannot tell you what that means to me," because he was not always able to articulate the interior things, but he could show it in the holding, and in the fact that his face had broken open in a way that she had not seen before, and that made her feel in the best possible way that she was looking at something essential. She smiled. The real smile, the unguarded one. The one he had been cataloging since October. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "A little," she said honestly. "Are you?" "A great deal," he said, "and extraordinarily happy about it." She laughed, and he did too, which was something they had gotten better at together, the laughing, the ease of it. She was better at laughing than she had been in October. He was better at many things than he had been in October. Gerald, when informed, sat down in his chair at the kitchen table and covered his face with his hands for a moment in the way of a man whose emotion has exceeded his ability to maintain the appearance of composure. He uncovered his face and said, "Your mother would have been very glad," which was the most personal thing he said about anything, and Birdie went to him and embraced him, and he held on. The baby arrived in March of 1884, exactly 1 year after the wedding, which the Dry Fork gossips found pleasingly symmetrical. It was a boy. They named him Gerald James Bailey, for the grandfather and for the long line of honest, unspectacular men who had nevertheless done right by their families in the particular quiet ways that matter most. Gerald Leland held the baby in the Leland house on a March afternoon, with the same stunned softness on his face that Levi had shown the moment his son was placed in his arms. And the four of them in that room contained, between them, enough happiness to account for considerable amounts of the previous year's difficulty. Birdie was back at the press within 6 weeks, which surprised no one. She brought the baby in a basket that sat near the compositor's tray, and Gerald rocked the basket with one foot while he read copy, and Levi came by at noon with food from Mabel's, and held his son with the practiced confidence of a man discovering that he is, against his prior understanding of himself, a natural father. The Caldwell County Courier continued to publish. The inquiry into Harlan Price's conduct had resulted in a formal censure and a civil penalty, and the state marshal had stabilized county law enforcement until a new sheriff, a man named Alvarez from Wichita, who was by all accounts genuinely committed to the work, was elected in the fall of 1883. The Carver operation had paid its fines and restored the creek bed, and the small farmers in the south part of the county had had 2 good seasons. The town was not perfect. No town in Kansas in the 1880s was perfect, and Birdie printed its imperfections faithfully, because that was the function of the press, and it was the work she believed in. But it was better. And better, in the incremental and hard-won way that real improvement usually happens, was worth printing. She wrote a piece in the spring of 1884, on the paper's 10th anniversary under the Leland name, about what a local newspaper was for. She wrote it as she wrote everything, precisely and with conviction, and she did not mention herself in it by name except in the byline. But what she described was the paper she had made it into, and the town it served, and the understanding that truth in print is a form of civic protection available to everyone. The circuit judge in Wichita had it reprinted in the State Legal Journal, which she noted in the following week's edition, with the single comment that the Courier was glad to be of service. Levi read the piece at the kitchen table on a Friday morning, while Gerald James ate something indeterminate and enthusiastic in the chair beside him. He read it through twice, which was what he did with things that meant something to him. Then he put the paper down on the table and looked at his wife across the kitchen. "It's good," he said. "I know," she said. She was at the stove, which was a concession to domestic routine she had made without resenting it, largely because Levi also cooked, and not badly, and they had negotiated the whole of their shared life with the same direct practicality they had brought to the original negotiation in the water rights matter. "It's more than good," he said. "It's important." She looked at him. He was still sitting at the table with the paper under his hands and their son making sounds beside him, and the morning light coming in through the kitchen window, and he was looking at her with all the things that 7 months of marriage and shared work and a child between them had built between two people who had both been alone too long and had finally, separately and then together, figured out what they actually needed. "Thank you," she said. "You don't need me to tell you it's good," he said. "No," she agreed. "But I like it when you do." He smiled, the full smile which had become more frequent and less hidden with the passing months. He looked down at Gerald James, who had managed to get something on his sleeve. He addressed the problem with a cloth and the competent patience of a man who has discovered that parenthood requires the same set of skills as everything else he was good at, which is sustained and attentive effort, and the willingness to try again when things don't go as planned. The summer of 1884 brought a drought that affected most of the county and required 2 of the affected ranch families to reorganize their operations significantly. Birdie covered it with her usual care. Levi organized a water-sharing arrangement between the livery stable, which had a large cistern, and 3 neighboring properties, which was informal and unwritten and worked, because everyone involved trusted the man who proposed it. Mabel Crow's Diner became a gathering point during the drought weeks, where families came to eat cheaply and share information and feel less isolated by their difficulties. Birdie and Levi were often there in the evenings, part of the texture of the place, the newspaper editor and the livery man who had come to Dry Fork under difficult circumstances and had become, by a combination of integrity and stubbornness and 1 cup of coffee at a critical moment, something the town considered its own. Tommy Graves, now 17, had started helping Levi at the livery on weekends and was developing into a genuinely skilled horseman. Levi took this seriously in the way of a man who understands that skill passed on is skill multiplied, and he spent time with Tommy that was teaching without the explicit structure of teaching, which is the most effective kind. Gerald Leland's health declined again in the autumn of 1884. The cough that had come and gone came back with more persistence, and by October he was spending more mornings in bed than at the press, and Birdie managed the paper with the help of a typesetter she hired, a methodical young man from Wichita named Paul, while also managing her father's care with the practical and unsentimental love of a daughter who is doing everything that can be done and knows it. Levi took on the heavier press work without being asked. He was up before dawn most mornings to open the livery, and on Tuesdays and Thursdays he spent his midday hour at the courier office, not because he was needed precisely, but because Birdie was there and the weight of her father's illness was a thing she carried without complaint, and he understood that what she needed was not management of the weight but company while she carried it. Gerald James learned to walk in November of 1884, which filled the house with a new dimension of noise and chaos that Gerald Leland found purely delightful. He rallied somewhat in November, better than expected, and there were evenings when the 3 adults and the toddling 1-year-old were together in the house with the lamp lit, and the chess board between Gerald and Levi and Birdie feeding Gerald James from a bowl at the kitchen table. And the house was so full of the particular warmth of people who love each other and have chosen each other that it pressed pleasantly against the walls. Gerald Leland died in January of 1885. He died in his bed on a Tuesday night, peacefully, with Birdie beside him. He had been conscious through the afternoon and had spoken to her with the clarity that sometimes returns to people at the end, and what he said was both specific and sufficient. He told her she was the best work of his life, which was a large thing to say for a man who had given 40 years to newspapers. He told her that Levi was a good man and that he had known it since the Thursday evening in October when Levi had read his daughter's draft article and told her how to make it more accurate without attempting to make it smaller. He told her that Gerald James had his grandmother's hands and that was a good thing. She told him she loved him. She held his hand. He died as morning was coming. Levi was there. He had come over late the previous evening when the nature of the night became clear, and he had sat in the kitchen through the dark hours and been present in the way that mattered, which was quietly and consistently, and without requiring anything of her. And when it was over he came and held her while she wept, which she did finally and completely, having been waiting until it was appropriate, and he held her with all the steadiness of a man who has chosen to be the kind of person you can hold on to. The Courier ran a tribute to Gerald Leland in the following Friday edition. Birdie wrote it herself, every word of it, and it was the finest piece of writing she had ever produced, not because of its technical quality, which was high, but because of the truth it contained. She wrote about what he had believed journalism was for, and about the small, consistent courage of a man who had printed the truth in a county where the truth was sometimes inconvenient, and who had never once in 40 years printed a thing he did not believe, and she published it in full knowledge that it was both a tribute to her father and a statement of the principles she intended to carry forward. The whole county read it. Several people came to the Courier office to tell her so. Mabel Crow came and sat with her for an hour on a Thursday afternoon and did not say very much at all, which was exactly right. The spring of 1885 was the beginning of something that felt, for the first time, like pure forward motion without the undertow of threat or loss or unresolved danger. The Courier was stable. The livery was doing well enough that Levi was able to hire Curtis full-time and take on a second hand. Gerald James was 18 months old and deeply invested in the enterprise of moving at high speed through any available space, which kept both his parents in a state of alert attention that was also, inexplicably and completely, a form of joy. Birdie discovered in April that she was expecting again. This time she told Levi at the livery stable, on a Wednesday morning, because she had not wanted to wait until evening. He was holding a halter in one hand, and he stood there in the doorway of the stable with the spring light behind him, and the look on his face was the same as before. The same opening, but with less surprise this time and more the quality of a man who has decided that this is his life and that it is the best life he can imagine. He dropped the halter. He crossed the stable and kissed her, not the contained and deliberate kiss of courtship, but the kiss of a man in his own life kissing the person who is the center of it. "You walked into a room with a loaded gun and brought me coffee," he said against her hair. She laughed. "You needed it." "I needed considerably more than coffee," he said. "I just didn't know it yet." She pulled back and looked at him. "You knew," she said. He considered this with the honest precision he applied to self-examination. "I suspected," he said, "from the moment you set the cup down." "You looked at me like I was the strangest thing you'd ever seen," she said. "You were," he said. "You still are." In the best possible way. The second baby arrived in November of 1885. 2 days before Gerald James's second birthday, which created a domestic situation that the household managed with good humor and the particular improvisational competence of two people who are genuinely good at being partners. The baby was a girl. They named her Eleanor, for Levi's mother, who had been a woman of considerable practical intelligence about whom he had spoken to Birdie one winter evening with a detail and warmth that told her something essential about the man, which was that he came from love and had simply been a long time away from it. Eleanor was a different creature from her brother in every respect, quieter, more watchful, with Levi's gray-green eyes and a degree of focused attention that made Gerald James, who was unsubtle and vigorous, regard her with the perplexed respect of someone who suspects they are in the presence of something they don't entirely understand. The house was very full. Levi expanded the back of it in the spring of 1886, adding a room for the children and a larger kitchen, doing much of the work himself in the evenings, and on Sundays with Curtis's help and the occasional assistance of Tommy Graves, who was now 18 and had grown into a young man of considerable capability and almost no ego about it, which Levi considered his finest quality. Birdie ran the Courier through all of it. She ran it from the office and from the kitchen table and from the corner of the children's room where she had put a small writing desk, and she ran it with the same conviction and the same careful accuracy she always had, and the paper under her name became, over the years, a thing that people in the wider state knew about and occasionally cited. A reporter from the Kansas City paper came to interview her in 1887, which she found mildly embarrassing and professionally gratifying in roughly equal measure, and the resulting piece described her as one of the most important small-town editors in Kansas, which she read once, said "well," and filed. Levi read it 3 times. He clipped it from the Kansas City paper and put it in the drawer where he kept things of significance, alongside the Ford County clerk's letter and a photograph from their wedding and the first letter he had received from his brother Daniel after the long silence, which had contained, among other things, the information that Daniel was married and had a daughter, and that he would very much like to come to Kansas if Levi would have them. Daniel Bailey and his wife, a steady and forthright woman named Ruth, and their daughter, who was 4, visited Dry Fork in the summer of 1887. It was 5 years since the brothers had seen each other, and the reunion had the quality of something long owed being finally paid, which is a specific and generous kind of happiness. Daniel was shorter than Levi and louder, and had a wide, easy laugh that filled any room he was in, and he and Birdie understood each other immediately in the particular way of 2 people who love the same person and recognize that neither of them is going to be difficult about it. Ruth and Birdie spent 3 evenings at the kitchen table talking, while the men and the children occupied themselves in the yard, and what they talked about was the kind of thing women talked about in the 1880s when they were among themselves, and at their ease, which was everything: the management of households and the raising of children and the work they each did, and the specific texture of the lives they had built. They liked each other very much. Birdie told Levi afterward that she hoped Daniel and Ruth would come back. They did. They came back the following summer, and the summer after that, and in 1890 Daniel moved his family to Wichita, which was close enough for regular correspondence and occasional visits, which became a steady rhythm of connection that Levi had not had since before the Colorado trouble, and which he valued in a way that had no adequate language, except perhaps the loosening, over time, of a tension he had carried so long it had come to feel like a physical feature. Gerald James started school in 1887 and revealed himself to be both extremely clever and extremely uninterested in sitting still, which was a challenge for his teacher and a source of constant diplomatic correspondence between Birdie and the schoolroom. Eleanor started school 2 years later and sat so quietly and absorbed information so thoroughly that her teacher sent home a note of the specifically amazed kind that some children generate in educators who were not expecting to be amazed. Birdie and Levi watched their children become themselves with the interest and occasional bewilderment that is the experience of every parent who understands that children are their own people, and that the most you can do is love them and give them the conditions in which their actual natures can develop. In 1888, a woman named Clara Reyes arrived in Dry Fork with 2 children and very little else, having traveled from New Mexico Territory following the death of her husband. She came to the Courier office first, because she had heard there was a woman editor in the town, and Birdie listened to her situation and helped her find accommodation and introduced her to Mabel, who gave her work in the diner, and wrote a brief and discreet notice in the Courier that had the effect of bringing several offers of help from the community without broadcasting Clara's circumstances to the prurient. Clara stayed. She became part of the fabric of the town, and her eldest child, a boy of 10 named Marco, eventually began helping at the livery and demonstrated such a natural affinity for horses that Levi, recognizing something familiar, invested in his training with the same sustained attention he had given Tommy. The town grew gradually through the late 1880s, as towns along the rail lines did, not explosively but steadily, new families arriving with new ambitions and the particular optimism of people who have chosen a place rather than merely arrived in one. The Silver Spur changed hands, and under the new management became somewhat less the venue of consequence it had been during the Price era. The church was expanded. A doctor arrived in 1889, a young man named Garrett who had trained in St. Louis and who, much to everyone's relief, actually knew what he was doing. He and Birdie established a productive professional relationship based on their mutual conviction that information was protective, and that the community was better served by accurate accounts of public health matters than by the various superstitions that had previously served in their place. Mabel Crow, who had been fighting the county council's smaller corruptions for years, finally ran for a council seat herself in 1889 and won it with a majority that surprised only the people who had not been paying attention. Birdie covered the campaign and the victory with the care she brought to everything, and the friendship between the two women, which had always been mutual and warm, deepened into the specific ease of two people who have been fighting the same battles from adjacent positions and have learned to trust each other completely. The 1890s arrived, and with them the gradual transformation of everything, the railroad carrying goods and people and ideas faster than the buckboard era had imagined possible, the territories becoming states, the wide and ungoverned spaces of the West filling with the structures of law and commerce and community that are the ambivalent achievements of settlement. Birdie watched and wrote. Levi watched and worked. Gerald James, at 9, began setting type in the courier office with the same absorbed attention his grandfather had shown, which made Birdie very quiet when she first noticed it. Eleanor, at 7, was already reading anything she could get her hands on, including the courier front to back every week, and offering opinions about the articles in the direct and specific way of a child who comes naturally by her editorial instincts. Levi turned 35 in 1890. Birdie turned 30 in the same year. They celebrated both birthdays together at Mabel's diner, with Daniel and Ruth visiting and the children chaotic with cake, and afterward, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, they sat on the porch of the expanded house in the summer dark and Levi held her hand the way he had in the buckboard on the way to Wichita that long-ago October night. "Are you happy?" she asked him. It was not an anxious question. It was the genuine curiosity of a person checking in with someone they love. He considered it with his usual honest precision. "I am the happiest I have ever been," he said, "and I think I am still becoming happier, which is a strange thing to understand about a life." She leaned against him. He put his arm around her. The Kansas night was enormous and soft and full of sound, the crickets and the far-off call of something in the grassland and the horses shifting in the livery down the street. "I think about that morning sometimes," she said. "The jail. I think about it often," he said. "You looked at me like I was the strangest thing in the world," she said, "when I set the coffee down. You were in a room with a loaded gun," he said. "Bringing a man you barely knew a cup of coffee. You needed it," she said again, which was what she had said in the stable 4 years ago. "I needed you," he said. "The coffee was incidental," she laughed. He felt it against his shoulder. He turned his head and kissed her hair. "Birdie," he said. She said. "Thank you," he said. She knew what he meant. It was the same thing he had meant every time he had said those 2 words to her since that October morning in 1882. "Thank you for the coffee. Thank you for untying the ropes. Thank you for the Ford County letter and the Topeka Register and the buckboard to Wichita. Thank you for believing me when you had no particular reason to. Thank you for being the kind of person who walks into a room with a loaded gun carrying a cup of coffee and sets it down like a statement. Thank you for staying. Thank you for making it possible for me to stay." "You're welcome," she said. Every single time. They stayed on the porch a while longer in the warm Kansas night, until the lamp inside burned low and the last of the crickets quieted, and the stars rotated in their reliable and ancient pattern overhead. Then they went inside, into the house that was full of sleeping children and the smell of paper and coffee and horses, and the ordinary accumulated warmth of a life that had been built from nothing, which is to say from two people who had found each other at the right time and been brave enough to stay. In the Courier office, the press stood quiet and patient. The compositor's tray held type for the following week's edition, which would cover the new water management policy the county had finally formalized, the expansion of the schoolhouse, and a profile of Clara Reyes's eldest boy, who had just turned 18 and was preparing to take over a portion of the livery work from Curtis, who was starting his own operation in Wichita. It was the news of a functioning and imperfect and forward-moving community, which was the only kind of news worth the paper it was printed on. Outside, Dry Fork breathed in the October dark. The cottonwoods had turned. The moon was rising over the flat horizon. Somewhere on the Dobson Road, a coyote called once and was answered. Levi Bailey, most wanted man in Caldwell County in the autumn of 1882, closed the door of his house on the night of his 35th year and turned the lamp out and went to the room where his wife was already at the writing table with one candle and her notebook, because she had thought of something she needed to write down before she forgot it, which was a thing she did, and which he had long since accepted as simply Birdie, which was simply the thing he loved most in all the world. He looked at her in the candlelight. She looked up at him with those direct dark eyes and the slight curve of her mouth. "Come to bed," he said. "One moment," she said, and wrote 3 more lines in the notebook, and then set it down and blew out the candle. The house was dark and full and still, and outside the October moon rose over Kansas, and inside everything that mattered was exactly where it was supposed to be.